So a few years ago, we did a comparison between the X100F and the X-T5 with the 23mm, and it's a bit of an odd comparison because the cameras obviously sit in very different segments, but it was an interesting comparison for me anyway, and a lot of you watched that video. So I thought I'd do that again, but this time with the latest cameras from Fujifilm, the X100V and the X-T5. Now, the X100V has had a few upgrades, mainly with the lens. So I think it would be interesting to see how this lens has improved over time compared to the 23mm f2, which hasn't been updated. So yeah, let's go around, take a few pictures and see how these cameras have aged. So, first impressions after all these years, and I have to say, it's very similar. Like, the ergonomics and the handling of the X-T5 is just a lot better than the X100V for a number of reasons. First of all, the dials on top make it a lot easier for me to change the settings. The lens size makes it a lot easier to change the aperture ring, and also you've got the tilty, flippy screen or whatever it is called. It just makes shooting with this camera much easier, especially considering the ergonomics. The ergonomics on this camera, so much better. Bigger grip, the lens is bigger so you can hold the camera more effectively. It's just such a joy to shoot with. But that's not to say that the X100V isn't a joy. It is. I love shooting with this camera. It's cute, it's tiny, it fits in my pocket. I can shoot with this really comfortably. The only thing I dislike about it is, one, the lens or the aperture is just a little bit fiddly. Like, you got to get your fingers in there just to be able to change the aperture. And then also the dial, the ISO dial, like, changing the ISO dial, you got to lift this dial up and then twist it to be able to change the ISO. But what happens is, if you haven't got it exactly on the setting, you can't press it in, and then you're fiddling there for like a few seconds. It just annoys the hell out of me. However, the thing I do like about this camera is that it does have a tilt screen. So that's very useful, because when you're shooting with this camera and you want to get onto those lower angles, so much easier shooting with this camera. But other than that, you know, the X-T5 obviously a much better camera system when it comes to ergonomics and handling.
Now, one of the more interesting things I noticed about the X100V is that it seems to be shooting a little bit longer when it comes to the field of view in comparison to the 23mm on the X-T5. The 23mm on the X-T5 has an angle of view of around 63.4 degrees, which is in line with virtually every other 35mm lens available from Canon, Nikon and Sony. However, the X100V, I don't know exactly what the angle of view is because I couldn't find that information, but it does definitely seem to be shooting longer compared to the 23mm. And you can see over here, when you're comparing both images shot from the same distance, the X-T5 on the 23mm f2 is capturing more of the scene.
Now, there are a bunch of things that I love about the X100V camera, and after all these years shooting with this camera again, it's just kind of brought it all back. And the first thing I love about this camera is the hybrid viewfinder. I love the hybrid viewfinder in this camera. It's just unique. I don't think I've ever seen it in any other camera system, but I love this hybrid viewfinder. You know, you have the optical viewfinder option with an overlay, so you can see what the composition is going to look like. You've got the option to have a little mini screen in the bottom right hand corner, and finally you also have an option to have a complete EVF in this camera, which is where I normally shoot with. I prefer the EVF in general, not because it's better than the optical, it's just that I can compose more effectively with the EVF than I can with the optical, and all of it can be controlled with this little dial on the front over here, so it's so much easier to shoot with, and I love that about this camera. You know, manually focusing with the little mini screen on the in the bottom right hand corner is just a joy, and I have to say, shooting with this camera is a lot of fun. especially considering how compact it is. Like, this lens is tiny, and because of that, it fits in my coat pocket comfortably. I can walk around with it, shoot with this, no problem. And I just love shooting with this. It's just fun. Like, honest to God, it is just so much fun shooting with this camera compared to the X-T5. Now, this is not a boring camera to shoot with. It's just not quite as fun as the X100V. Like, this camera is very structured. It's very much like a professional camera system, and it feels like work when I'm shooting with this. It doesn't have the interesting quirks. It doesn't have the little, the hybrid viewfinder. It's got everything which is functionally beneficial if you're a professional photographer, which is obviously a good thing if you are a professional photographer and you're going to go out and shoot with this camera to try and make some money. But if you want to go out and shoot and have some fun, this is definitely the camera. So I know how much I've been talking about how the X100V is a lot of fun to shoot with, and it is. It's a lot of fun to shoot with this little camera, but there is one major advantage that the X-T series of cameras has over the X100, and that is the fact that you can change lenses. So it's getting a little bit darker out here, and because it's getting a little bit darker, I'm gonna have to start bumping up the ISO as we shoot more. And one of the best ways to get better results is, instead of bumping up the ISO, just shoot with a wider aperture. And Fuji does have a 23mm f1.4, which is a gorgeous lens, and that's one major advantage you have with these camera systems versus the X100V. So I've changed over to the 23 f1.4 now, which is cheating, I know, but it's one of his advantages, so I'm going to make full use of that.
So now that we have the images opened up in Lightroom, we can start to look at some of the key differences between both of these lenses. And the biggest difference that I noticed when I was out and about shooting was that the flaring on the 23 f2, I'm not a fan of it. I don't like the look of it. To me, it's ugly. The colors, it's introducing some weird colors into the frame. Whereas the flaring on the X100V, it looks almost, it looks cinematic. It looks beautiful. Yes, there's a little bit of an obstruction there, but it's not that big of a deal. Overall, the flaring, in my opinion, looks significantly better on the X100V in comparison to the 23 f2, and that makes sense because this is a newer design, it's a new lens, and Fuji probably used some better coatings, they probably used some better elements or more modern elements in the X100V compared to the 23 f2, which is getting a little bit long in the tooth now. It hasn't been updated in a while. Also, colors. This is with auto white balance on both. When I put it at daylight white balance, the colors go really weird. Like, this leans heavily into the green and this leans heavily into the magentas. So there's a big difference in that. So I left it out at auto white balance in Lightroom and in camera. And even with that, same color profile, the X100V just looks better. Like, look over here on the ground and look over here, this is just a little bit nicer looking. The tree, the color, the green tones in the tree looks a little bit better. The building looks, it just has like a little bit more of a sparkle. Obviously, this could be down to a number of issues or a number of factors, the lens, the way that the image has been rendered. But for me, based on the way that I've been shooting and when I've gone back and forth between different profiles and adjusted the white balance, it does look like this is predominantly from the lens. The color and the flaring from the lens is causing a big difference in how the overall image looks. For the second comparison, we're looking at this portrait that I took of Maisie, and when it comes to sharpness, detail and clarity, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference. The differences are negligible. However, there does seem to be quite a noticeable difference when it comes to color. So if you look at the green pendant over here versus the X-T5, the X100V seems to be doing a much better job, and that could be because of the lens or the sensor or a combination of the both, but the X100V, I think, does a better job both in skin tones, in terms of the greens, and even when it comes to the pants. Like, the mustard color is coming through more effectively. Like, this is leaning way too much into the orange tones. I feel like for many of the shots that I took, the X100V tends to do a slightly better job when it comes to color, and I believe that it's more down to the lens than it is the actual sensor, although the sensors are different between both of these two. And despite the fact that this is a 40 megapixel sensor, this is a 26 megapixel sensor, you know, it's not that different in terms of detail and clarity. However, there is a noticeable difference when it comes to the color. Moving on to the control test, if I zoom in over here, we can start seeing some of the differences. And the X100V, or the lens on the X100V, does seem to be a tiny bit sharper in comparison to the 23 f2. It's not a huge amount, but it definitely shows a little bit more sharpness, although the X100V does have more chromatic aberrations as well. So if you look over here versus the 23 f2, the X100V has noticeably worse chromatic aberrations in comparison to the 23 f2 on the X-T5. So, you know, personally, I think chromatic aberrations are more of a problem than a slightly softer lens. So for me, I would always lean towards a lens, even if it's a little bit softer, I would always lean towards a softer lens that has better control when it comes to color. Stopping down to f4, and both of these lenses sharpen up incredibly well. The chromatic aberrations on the X100V pretty much disappear, and you know, the X100V is just a tiny bit sharper in the center, and on the edges it does seem like it's got a little bit of extra sharpness, but it's not a major difference. Overall, these are basically performing on par when you're shooting around f4. f2 is where the major differences are. Yes, the X100V is just slightly sharper, but it does have more chromatic aberrations, but f4, and they both pretty much equal. However, there is one thing that the X100V can do that the X-T5 and most other mirrorless cameras cannot do, and that is shoot at 1/1000th of a second shutter speed and still expose the whole sensor correctly. As you can see over here with the X-T5, a portion of the sensor has not been exposed, and that's because the flash hit the shutter blade as it was coming down the sensor. Even at 1/500th of a second, which is half the shutter speed, still could not expose the full sensor. So most mirrorless cameras, or most mirrorless camera systems, use a focal plane shutter, which is in the camera. The X100V, however, has a leaf shutter, which is in the lens, and because it's in the lens and because it's a leaf shutter mechanism, it can allow the camera to sync with flash at much higher shutter speeds. And these features, or this particular feature, is generally found in really expensive premium camera systems like Hasselblad and Phase 1. So it's really nice to see Fujifilm continue with the leaf shutter mechanism in the X100 series of cameras. Just to clarify, this leaf shutter mechanism, I believe, is in every single X100 series camera. So great to see something like this in a little compact APS-C camera. And finally, we have the 23 f1.4 lens over here on the right, and when shot wide open, you can see just how much sharper the f1.4 lens is compared to the f2 on the X100V. I mean, this f1.4 lens is incredible. It is leagues ahead. Both the 23 f2 lenses, it's just a ridiculous performance. This lens is just amazing. I mean, wide open, f1.4, this is a full stop wider, and it's still ridiculously sharp. In fact, the f1.4 lens is so ridiculously sharp that even when you stop down to f5.6 on the X100V, the f1.4 lens is still sharper. Like, look at the contrast, the color, the detail. This lens is unbelievably good. It's leagues ahead, completely different league. This is just head and shoulders above most other 35mm equivalent lenses. It is a gorgeous performer. I mean, yes, it does cost quite a bit more than the 23 f2 lens, but the performance is definitely there. This is just incredible lens.
So there you have it. That's how the X100V compares against the X-T5 and the 23 f2. And honestly, this is an awkward comparison. It's an unfair comparison. It's not meant to be taken seriously. It was done mostly out of fun and curiosity. But I did notice one thing whilst doing this comparison, and that is that Fujifilm really needs to update the 23 f2 lens, because it does not stack up well with some of the newer lenses that Fujifilm is producing. The flaring, the colors, and the sharpness maybe, but it's mostly the flaring and the colors. I think that a newer lens with some better coatings would go down really well, especially if it sits within the same price range, because for many photographers, the 23 f2 is a brilliant option that produces great results without breaking the bank. So If Fujifilm can produce an update like a potential Mark II with some better coatings and some better colors and so on, then I think that would go down extremely well with many photographers out there. And I know I'd be very happy with a update to this lens as well. It's been around for years and it hasn't had an update, so I do think Fujifilm should update the 23 f2. But yeah, that's the comparison. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, share this video, and hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.